Welcome to the Why God Why podcast. I am solo co-hosting. My name's Peter Englert. I serve at Browncroft Community Church. We're here with our producer, Nathan Yoder. And I want to just take a moment to welcome Carl Binger. Carl, this is your third time on the podcast.
I'm honored, man. I'm honored. You know,
I love
Why
it.
God, why superstar, you know?
Why God Why? It's like Saturday Night Live. We
Yeah.
got you back, but
Listen,
I love it. So we are in the midst of a series. Why does reconciliation matter to fill in the blank?
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is we just sense that people are asking this question. We live in a polarized society. We live, of course, I think most people think of racial reconciliation, but we wanted to come at this topic of reconciliation. First of all, what's the Christian perspective? But then second of all, I think there's different phases and different areas of society that we don't think about how it impacts. And I'm so excited to have Carl here. Carl just wrote a book called The Progressive Darkness about depression. He's got a podcast called Surviving Depression. If you're watching on video, he's repping his t-shirt. So that's what I'm talking about right there. So our question today is, why does reconciliation matter to mental health? Carl, give me a quick update of your life. I'm sorry, we got to get going, but we're friends, so yeah.
Right, yeah, man. Thank you again for having me on, man. I just praise God for what you're doing, what Browncroft is doing, and man, I am just so honored to be here. So thank you, and I just thank God, man. I've just been busy, man, trying to really help people get the word out. Like, there's a lot of people that need help in the church, outside of the church. So I just got to thinking, all right, listen, I'm not great at really technical things, but I need to get on a podcast so I can get this message out. If it's only to 5 people, who cares? But if it reaches more, glory to God. And so I've been doing the Surviving Depression podcast, just finished season 1. It's about 7 episodes. And then I actually added some poems from my book. I just been reading them out loud to some music, and really just hoping that whoever's going through a dark time can listen to those and hear, okay, well, Carl went through it. I'm not the only one who's went through it. You know what I mean? And so,
Man, well, and something, you and I are in the babies of, the pandemic. When was your baby born?
December 20. Nope. That's Derek. Derek was December 23rd. Travis was December 11th, I believe. I lose track. It was December something.
Well, and for me, Lucy was born in February. So,
yeah. Yep.
So yeah, we're joining the club.
Yep.
Hey, so you and I, we had a great pre-meeting about this.
Mm-hmm.
We're asking the question today, why does reconciliation matter to mental health? And so something that we're going to be engaging and asking every guest is this. What's your definition or understanding of reconciliation?
Absolutely. So from a biblical perspective, reconciliation has to deal with when someone sins against you, like if a brother or sister sins against you, as Christ was teaching, you go to that person and you talk to them and you tell them of their offense, and I if I recall correctly, it's even as you're going to offer your gift at the altar. So if you're praying, if you're talking with God, if you're having a devotional, and you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, you go and talk to them and you say, hey, listen, this really offended me when you said that, or, hey, I would really like our relationship to get better after that heated conversation. And if they don't hear you, then you go and get someone else to, be a objective point of view. And, then it just progresses to when you get the church involved. But, most times I don't think it even gets to that point, right? Like, I think people, if they really, want to pursue reconciliation, it really doesn't go that far. And then, obviously there are some exceptions where churches don't really practice church discipline. They may just gloss over it and ignore it. But a biblical reconciliation is, hey, you offended me or I offended you in some way. Let's make it right. Let's talk about it first. Let's not gossip about each other, but let's talk to each other first.
I find it so fascinating. You went like micro, like because that's super practical. I want to kind of push your clinical side.
Yeah.
Because again, this is what the whole series is about. The biblical. You just explained that so well. But what would you say from a mental health perspective is a definition or understanding of reconciliation?
I honestly think mental health and clinical wisdom and knowledge borrows a lot from the Bible. They won't say it, but they do. But I think it's very similar in that you have to talk to people. You have to process these things. You have to journal. You have to go to counseling. But I think from a mental health perspective, you'd want to use various avenues to make sure that you're processing reconciliation in your heart and mind well. And so I think from a mental health perspective, it's not weighing so heavily on the spiritual side, but it's weighing heavily on the how is your mental and emotional health responding to this? Whereas I do believe the Bible is saying if you pursue this spiritually, a lot of times it will affect you holistically. But mental health is typically not focusing so much on the spiritual dimension, which can handicap an individual sometimes. But on the flip side, it could do that, in religious Christian circles too, where they're so focused on the spiritual that they neglect the mental health side.
As I was preparing for this episode, I was thinking about the stigma of mental health. And I feel like in the last 10 years, but specifically in the last 5 years, like for me to say I go to a counselor, it's not a big deal. I say that kind of without embarrassment. And as I was thinking about this episode of reconciliation, and even with what you just said, I almost feel like, and you can push back against me with this, I almost feel like the stigma is like the other way, where it's like, I'm just going to go to my counselor. And why I see that as important, you delineated the spiritual from maybe the mental or the physical, but ultimately positive mental health, with or without Jesus. My wife's a therapist. You're uniting all of those together. And so I guess I'm just wondering, where are we with the stigma of mental health? Because if you're on one end of the stigma, where you're not pursuing mental health, you're kind of divided. You're not even reconciled to yourself. But on the other hand, you can fall into the trap of, oh yeah, I'm working on my mental health, but that kind of leaves you just, I'm just handling this over here, to not really deal with your issues. Does that make any sense?
It does. Absolutely. And, I guess I've never really thought of it that way in terms of, there being a bit of a shift in terms of people, seeking mental health more and then just kind of neglecting the spiritual part, which I think is very valid. I just think you have to deal with it holistically. You have to say, okay, because here's the thing, God has given us these tools now in this lifetime because we need them. You know what I mean? Like, there wasn't mental health counseling back in the New Testament days, right? And it's because God saw fit that they didn't need it at the time, for whatever reason. Maybe their diet had a certain like a certain food or something that kept them healthier during that time. But in this time, we have a resource that we should definitely take advantage of, along with seeking out our spiritual health, seeking out our mental health, seeking out our physical health, and taking advantage of all of them even if you don't feel like you need it, to go do it anyway, just to get a check, because as the Bible and as Jesus has shown us thousands of times, we have blind spots. So you may go into counseling and all of a sudden, oh, you know what? You're a little too bossy, or you're a little too grumpy, or you know what I mean? Like, you discover that over time. And so I think you really have to cover, everything, so.
No, I think that's huge, because at times we try to fix a mental health problem when it's you really need more sleep. And we try to fix a physical problem when it's really a mental health problem. And that's, I mean, maybe I'm being too broad with the word reconciliation, but like that's what we're trying to talk about here, is
Right.
to see all of that come together.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
So let's come back to this idea of reconciliation. You went right to micro, which I love, which is about, people reconciling with each other, asking for forgiveness. I guess, how in your life you've been so open about your anxiety and depression. Can you think of a specific moment where you said, my health or struggle with mental health was directly tied to some sort of reconciliation?
Absolutely. I can. Yeah, for sure. I think there was a point in my life where I had strained relationships. For whatever reason, the relationships went really bad, and I just essentially, initially tried to talk about it and apologize for some things, but felt as if the vulnerability and the apology wasn't reciprocated in my eyes, and so it turned into bitterness. And so I walked around for months and months with bitterness, and I'd ask God, forgive me of this bitterness. What can I do with this bitterness? And I knew that I had, did what Jesus said in the passage about going to that person and talking about the offense. We talked about it a couple of different times, but that bitterness just wasn't disappearing. So I'm like, God, what is this? Like, I did what you asked me to do, right? And so then I started to think, okay, I'm sitting up here as a therapist telling people to go get help if they're having this emotional, like, bitterness or depression, or this like prison of just anger. And I'm like, I need to go talk to a counselor. And I did. I went and talked to a counselor, and it really helped me a lot, because I was so used to, and this is what I would encourage everyone to do, because I've practiced it a lot, but this is why I think it's so important to talk to someone else, is because even though I journal and I preach it, that you should journal, and I think you should, and I think it's a blessing from God, I think you have to talk to someone, and you have to talk to a trained professional, and that'll take you over the top. I really do believe that. And that helped me, because I was praying, I was reading scripture, I talked to the people who I felt offended me, but I was still feeling bitterness. And that bitterness really didn't lift until I started to process it even deeper with someone outside of myself.
As you're talking, I'm playing around with this idea. So this is, I mean, we should just call this podcast like, Carl and Peter have coffee together.
Yeah, that's
Coffee talk. Because, so I've been in your shoes before. So like there's a certain person in my life that like I really looked up to, and then I ended up working in the same organization as them, and I no longer work for that I work for Browncroft. But like I got to see like a different side of them. I was really disappointed. And I guess in my head, what I've said about this person is I forgave them. I'm not sure I can reconcile with them. But like what I'm hearing from you is you wanted, and again, maybe these levels don't, and this might be semantics, but it's just kind of helping me. I feel like you can forgive someone and not be reconciled to them. And like the forgiveness is like I release, and I'm struggling even how to say this, but like I release holding judgment against you.
Yes.
But I don't think that we're going to have a future relationship.
Absolutely.
I feel like reconciliation is, and probably where you might have felt disappointment, and I'm not trying to put word, is I not only thought I was going to forgive you, but I thought we were going to reconcile.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that
that makes
pushback?
Perfect sense. No pushback here. Perfect sense. And I think that's what the listeners have to really understand is that you have to temper your expectations, because that's a big thing too. Like your expectations were this relationship is going to return back to normal or even better. And it could, by the grace of God, anything is possible, but that may not happen in this lifetime. And I don't think it's wrong if it doesn't. I think you do everything you can. If you really believe God is pushing you towards that, and he will make it clear, you know what I mean? It's not going to be a surprise. But if God is pushing you towards that relationship, he will work in the other person too. And you guys will reconcile at some point, maybe 10 years from now, maybe 5 years from now, because we all mature, in Christ. There is sanctification. And so there is that possibility. But I think really tempering our expectations around what reconciliation looks like. Honestly, biblically speaking, if you do what Christ laid out in those passages, that is reconciliation. Like, I don't really see anywhere else where in that passage where he's saying you have to be like best friends now and you have to be hanging together. And I think ideally he would love us to be by the Spirit in a perfect bond of unity. But I think sometimes that unity can be sought in other places in the body, which is a really big body, right? So,
well, and so I hear people say, I can't forgive this person. And this might be Pollyanna, too idealistic. I would argue I can forgive this person. And for me, there's actually some mental health reasons. Like, I need to forgive and maybe this is selfish, but like, I need to forgive this person for my own sanity of I need to resolve this. I'm going to make this choice. That doesn't mean I do it right away, but I don't know if I can reconcile with them.
Right.
That's a whole, and I'm wondering, and maybe our listeners, they'll respond to this and they'll share it on social media and tell us, but there's probably people that you can't forget. And, we could bring up the most heinous acts. I can understand that I can't forgive, but like reconciliate like that. I just feel like that's a whole nother level.
Right. I will never sit up here and say it's easy to forgive someone. And if it is, we should be on our knees thanking Jesus if we could forgive someone easily. Every time we're able to forgive instantly and easily, we need to be thanking Jesus, because as C.S. Lewis once said, forgiveness sounds like a great idea until you have to do it, right? It sounds great, fantastic idea. Oh, that's honorable, that's noble. Well, now you do it. And it's hard. And that's why Jesus is so special. He is amazingly special in that he's demanding and commanding us to forgive people. And I believe it's in Matthew 18, the parable of the unforgiven servant. I mean, that speaks to every single Christian, is if no matter, and again, I don't want to diminish the pain that someone faces. I mean, anything from a child being molested to a brother or a sister being murdered to a grandmother dying of cancer and so on and so forth. I don't want to diminish the pain, but Jesus in that passage is saying, you have to forgive because I have forgiven you of such a greater offense, so great that any offense on this earth should be looked at as a micro infraction.
Well, see, this is where we're just having a conversation. I love what you just said. There's people that don't follow Jesus, though, and right. I think we're trying to give people the understanding from a Christian perspective. And what's interesting with mental health is mental health brings a unique perspective to reconciliation.
Yeah.
And what you just said there, the spiritual, I mean, we're almost kind of switching roles right now, but you're talking about the Bible, right. and I'm, because there's a cost to level 1 forgiving and level 2 not reconciling. You brought it up. You talked about bitterness. It's not like we can measure bitterness. It's not like I can go to your energy tank, and bitterness takes energy. So I think of someone that's hurt me in my life, that's affecting my mental health because, as a pastor once said to me, bitterness is allowing someone to live rent-free in my mind. So what that looks like is I get in the shower and I have this soliloquy quoting to this person how I will tell them off. And even if you don't follow Jesus, what mental health tells you is there's a problem.
Yep.
I was just listening to Steve Cuss, who wrote the book Managing Leadership Anxiety. He talks a lot about this because you can feel it in your chest. It's a racing mind. And again, we're probably going to mix anxiety and depression, but there's actually mental health identifiers that says, hey, this really isn't working for you.
Yep. And absolutely. And I felt that, and I still do from time to time, but I think when I continue to go back to that principle and that truth that I am forgiven, and who am I who is very undeserving of mercy? Who am I to then not extend mercy to someone else? You know what I mean? No matter what the offense is. And again, I don't want to diminish anyone's pain or trial, but I do want to say that forgiveness that you offer is the key to your freedom. And in that passage, Jesus likens that unforgiven servant to be placed in jail. And he says, so my Father will do to each of you if you don't forgive your brother from the heart. And so it's not, we all at some point in our lives have had unforgiveness, right? We weren't put in prison, right? We weren't put in a physical prison, right? But what Christ is talking about is, I believe, an emotional, spiritual prison where you feel what you were saying about that anxiety and the weight of it, of the bitterness, that I was feeling. It drains you. And that's what Christ is talking about. He didn't say, if you don't forgive, you're not my child anymore. He says, this is what my Father will do to you if you don't forgive your brother. He's using family terms. So you're still in the family, but you're in, I don't even want to call it timeout because it's worse than timeout. I'll take a timeout, but to feel like you say, have someone to live rent free in your head based off of your lack of extending grace to them, it starts to drain you, and it starts to affect your attitude, not just towards them, but maybe even towards other people, in similar situations and positions, So
let's kind of frame, I mean, mental health is so big. I just kind of want to, we've kind of walked through bitterness and forgiveness, but I want to kind of walk through different facets of mental health and kind of just your observations of the relationships between reconciliation. So let's start first. You wrote a book, you've run a podcast on depression.
Right.
How do you see the intertwining of reconciliation and depression, positive and negative?
I believe the sooner you move towards reconciliation, as fast as you can, by the grace of God, you will start to notice a difference in the depression you're feeling. That's of course if it's not clinical. You know what I mean? If it's clinical, you can do and check off every religious box, and you're still gonna feel depressed. But if you have friction with someone, let's just, even if you take it out of the religious context, if you have a conflict with a sibling, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, whatever, it's just human nature. It's built into our DNA, where if there's a conflict, it's not gonna resolve until we address it. And your mental health, depending on your disposition, depending on how you were raised, depending on your chemicals and physiological makeup, you're going to respond a certain way, physically and emotionally. But I believe just how we were designed, when we pursue healing and forgiveness, those dynamics start to change for the better within us. When we go away from that, and when I say go away, I mean go away in a very negative way. Like if we go away like guns blazing, and we do that the whole time, that's gonna negatively impact our mental health. And so your depression is gonna get far worse, or at least a little worse, if you continue to try to purposely make the issue worse than it already was. You know what I mean?
We're going to come back to that a little bit. What about reconciliation and trauma?
That's a little bit. Trauma is not my thing as a therapist. I think it's a lot harder, honestly. And I'm very glad you brought that up too, because there is a lot of people out here hurting, especially in Christian circles, right? There's a lot of things happening. There's something in that one Buffalo summer camp that happened, a lot of victims over there, and then just things coming out with a lot of prominent pastors. And sort of, I would say kind of the same thing with trauma, in a sense that I would say, the Lord would want you to forgive this person, but the Lord is also very in tune with the suffering you've dealt with. And I believe the Lord has a certain level of mercy for these individuals. Like, I haven't thankfully experienced a huge trauma yet. God forbid, I hope not, none. But just based off of how Jesus is in Scripture, I think he has a certain mercy and a certain gentleness towards someone like that. Like a therapist who's working with someone with trauma, you can't go in just doing. You got to be very delicate. It's very delicate, and I think the most skilled and gifted surgeon, Jesus, can do that. And so I would say it's a little bit more delicate for people who've experienced trauma. Like, I don't think I would aggressively pursue them with Scripture in that regard, but I would really talk to them about their healing process more and what that looks like, because, trauma brings with it, like, nightmares and, all type of hypervigilance, and it's not something you can really just talk somebody through. You kind of have to you have to be with someone too. You have to walk with them through it too,
Well, it has me thinking about Job's friends, and I think we've talked about that. Job's gone through trauma. You know, you can call it trauma, you can call it grief, you can call it depression. And Job's friends were helpful until they said something.
Right.
And I think even what you're bringing up, the message of Christianity is we can sit in that ugly, painful, healing place longer than, and I say this more because the majority of Christians and churches that I meet, there seems to be this, we need to fix this now. We need to get reconciliation now. We need to get forgiveness now. Whereas even some of the examples that you're bringing up, and just even some of the spiritual pastors that have fallen, no, it is a process. You know, I found it interesting. You know, Steve Carter, who was from Willow Creek, the church had scandal. You know, he tweeted something that was so self-aware. You know, people say that they're angry at the church, and he said, you know, I've realized I'm really angry at 5 people. You know, and even because when I think about reconciling with a church, that just seems like impossible. How do I reconcile? But like, I think sometimes because of the trauma, because of the depression, and because of the pain, like at the end of the day, are you allowing 5 people? And that's tough, because I'm not just trying to dismiss and focus.
Right.
There's a fact to that, but there's also, I can totally understand the road to these 5 individuals,
Right.
like representing the whole church, or this, like it's tough. I don't know. I mean,
Right.
it's just tough.
Yeah. No, I think it's easy to do that. And I also think it depends on where people's heart is. You know what I mean? Because if you genuinely love Christ, it's going to be hard to dismiss a whole body of people, right? And then I think this is why it's so important, kind of going back to earlier in the conversation, it's so important to do that, like self-reflecting with someone, because you might find that blind spot of, what about you? Like, where is the log in your eye? You know what I mean? Because once if we go back again to just that parable, if we've been forgiven of so much, how can we then hold someone else? You know what I mean? At like, just on the most basic level, if I've been forgiven of so much, why am I then beating someone for lesser offenses? It kind of elevates me and put me in a place of arrogance and pride and bitterness, right? And that blinds me to really loving these people more, or other people more in the future, because I'm just taking a place of, you know, I've been wronged, and man, people are going to pay, you know. And it just handicaps us. I really just this imagery of being in a prison is so valid from the best teacher, because we are literally like shackled behind bars. We are prevented from doing more. We are prevented from loving better, because we're behind the bars of depression and bitterness and anger, you know.
Let's come back. What about reconciliation and anxiety?
I honestly, I think like all of these are like tied in together. For an example, I just started a book about the effects that food have on our brain, and these various foods have effects on different mental health disorders. And so I think with a situation like reconciliation, it's going to affect all of those mental illness. So if you're a person who suffers from PTSD, if you're a person who has anxiety, depression, OCD, whatever, that reconciliation, because it's a spiritual component, or you know, if it's a spiritual component that you're dealing with, it's going to permeate everything. And until you address it, you're gonna be more anxious. You're going to be hyper vigilant. You're going to not be able to sleep. You're going to think about these things in the shower. You're going to be depressed and start asking questions like, God, why don't I feel your presence? Why don't I feel like you love me anymore? God, why do I feel like because they treated me this way, you must feel this way about me? You start to question God because your perspective has been so tainted and so shaped by this lack of reconciliation. So this lack of reconciliation could then start to morph and affect your senses to where you're blind, and your mental illness or your mental health challenges start to, just become worse,
We've really, we've kind of stayed micro. I want to go really macro now. Over the last year,
Mm-hmm.
what's the mental health price that we've paid for lacking reconciliation? What's your perspective on that?
I mean, I'd say it's astronomical because, you have the pandemic that I think is contributing to it, all the isolation and all the fighting over you should wear a mask, you shouldn't wear a mask, you should get vaccinated, you shouldn't get vaccinated. Then the political, and then the racial components, the division in the church. It's just been astronomical pain and division, and so the mental health has been affected greatly, just greatly. And I really, I mean, I think at some point you can disagree with people, and it's okay to disagree, but I think at some point you have to say, I am called to love the people that God has placed in front of me and around me, and that's my job right now. And even if you don't believe in Christianity, or you don't believe in Scripture, and you don't have any faith at all, I think there's a certain measure of peace and just gratitude that you'll have in your heart when you're able to love people who think differently than you. That's just built into the fabric of who we are. Because if you're going around thinking, well, this person isn't vaccinated, or this person's silly for believing that wearing a mask is going to help them, you already have this narrative where you're tearing a person down. Whereas if you release that narrative, you'd be able to love them better. You'd be able to treat them better, and you'd look at them differently, but you're already building a narrative to where you can't even love them as effectively as you could, because you're tearing them down in your head already.
I want to go, in our two other podcasts, we've kind of gone here. So again, just for our listeners, Carl, you don't represent every Black person, but part of who God made you to be is Black.
Absolutely.
How can you help people understand your personal experience in this past year of being a Black person, in this integration of mental health and reconciliation, or disintegration? What would you want people to understand from your perspective and your point of view in that?
I've had several talks with relatives. My wife's white, and so I've had talks with some of her family. I've had talks with coworkers, and I think more than anything, what I have come to realize is I do think the church at large has been hurt by this past political season, and I think minorities have, and I personally feel hurt. I'm not gonna say, although I do believe minorities as a whole feel a certain kind of hurt and negativity from white evangelicalism. I think I just said that wrong, but you know what I mean.
No, you got that right. You're good.
I've personally, I do feel in a way let down a bit. I feel like not all churches, obviously, and not all large white churches, of course, but I do feel like the lack of responses to a lot of these issues that have come up in our society has made me question, do my white brothers and sisters care for me like they care for the other white brothers and sisters? Like I've been around them, I've worked with them, and I've felt love, but it's like, okay, if push came to shove, would they really care for me just because of Carl, or would they say, you know what I mean? Like, is it just Carl, or is it like Carl the black man, or like, I don't know. It's raised some questions for me where I've said, more than anything, I think we need to talk about the image of God and the importance of it in our black and brown brothers as well, because I don't feel like that's something. I feel like personally, like, okay, it's something I think people should know, but I don't think they really know it or believe it almost. And so I've kind of felt let down by that. Like, I felt like when these issues have come up, the responses have been almost like, well, that was just an isolated situation. But it's like, man, my whole family is black, and that could have happened to any of us. So, it hasn't caused me to like hate anyone, but it's just like sad, and it just has made me want heaven more. Um, and I really think, what these past situations have showed us, has shown us, is that more could be done, more should be done, and reaching out to these communities, and people being able to say, we had a certain view of white Christians based on like a national narrative, but this is no longer the case, because the white Christians we know, they love us, and they've shown it in so many ways. They've prayed with us. They've been on the streets with us. They've had multiple ministries open up to us, and not as a just like this giveaway, but this like, we want to empower this community to be better. You know what I mean? And so,
yeah, and just listening, it's so complicated.
yeah.
Well, let me back up. It's easy, but it's complicated.
Yeah.
And I find myself just in complicating conversations because, I think of even, there's right, but then there's right. And I don't know how to explain it. Like, you can have a piece of truth, but be blind to 6 other things that are true too.
Right.
And that's kind of been my frustration, is like, we can affirm that something is right. We can affirm the image of God, but that has to play out somewhere. And even listening to you talk, that's kind of where the disappointment is that this is a clear-cut issue that needs to be addressed. And there's does that sound about right? Or
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's easy in the sense that, really all you have to do is love people, and make yourself available to them. Have ministries catered to loving them. Like, that's what Jesus did, right? Like, the parable of the Good Samaritan, and I think that's a lot of times that's the church gets caught up in, let's take care of our own, and let's take care of like what's in front of us. But Jesus is sending us out into the world and saying, take care of the world, take care of these people that's hurting, mentally, physically, financially. They're sick, they need Jesus. Go out there and give them this message and love them. And again, I think like let's just say, like, for me, the message, and it has mobilized me. So I'm not sitting up here, just talking. It's mobilized me to where I'm like, okay, listen, I'm gonna take any gifts that God has given me, and I am going to go into the communities that are hurting the most, and offer free workshops, and you know uh, just do counseling and things towards these individuals who need it the most and who's suffering from these particular things. And so I I I think that has sort of, that sadness that I felt, it was remedied a little bit by saying, okay, we'll do something about it. If no one else is going to do something about it, you do something about it.
Well, and coming back to, even our topic,
Hmm.
I think the pushback to followers of Jesus, the pushback to people that care,
Hmm.
is if we were involved 20, 30 years later in the mental health crisis,
Mm.
in the conversation about racism,
Mm.
in the conversation about politics, what would have reconciliation looked like in 2020 with a pandemic? It probably would have been different.
Right.
And I think even, as I'm listening to you, it's a whole lot easier to pursue reconciliation when there isn't a major crisis or conflict.
Hmm.
And sometimes, so today I was reading, there's a story in Acts
Hmm.
where Philip, who's a follower of Jesus, through this crazy miracle ends up with an Ethiopian.
Hmm.
And this Ethiopian says, "Hey, I'm reading Isaiah." And it's a crazy story, but it could happen today, and you know, again, there might be someone that, but he's from Ethiopia. Obviously, he's not Jewish, different skin tones and everything. How much easier was that conversation about the gospel and reconciliation, and even because people were at peace with each other?
Right. Yeah.
Whereas now we're trying to have this conversation, and I hear a lot of hope from you. I'm so glad you're being authentic, but we've tried to have this conversation in crisis, which, I can speak as, as a white person, it is disorienting. It's hard to hear.
Right.
But like part of reconciliation and mental health is, and this is what the gospel says to us, can I live knowing who I am in Jesus and be humble enough that when I hear something that's going to disorient me, that I can at least process through it and almost be reconciled to myself.
Right. Yeah. And here's the thing. Coming to Christ is disorienting, right? That's the most disorienting thing. So it's kind of like going back to that parable again. It's going from the greater to the lesser. If God has forgiven us for so much, we could then forgive someone for something little. If our sin, it was such a terrible thing, and Christ paid the ultimate price, it's disorienting when we come to a holy God. So any issue in this world, because of who Jesus is and who we are in him, we can, by his grace, go into those hard conversations. And we should, because it'll tell us more about us, and it'll tell us more about the people we need to love, And so, I think of when Paul confronted Peter about, separating from the Gentiles to sit, next to the Jews. And Paul was like, nah, man, you're not living in Christ right now the way you're acting. Like, you're putting up a front here. It's terrible. It's not right. It's not godly. And he had that hard conversation with Peter. And I think, all conversations don't have to be that hard. I think, just sitting down like we are and saying, hey, man, how do you feel about all this? When people feel heard, they're not going to be mad. I always go back to the passage in James where it says we should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. if we are listening, nobody's going to be angry, right? If we're not speaking and just listening, no one's 90% of the time, no one's going to be angry if they feel like you're listening to them, right? So, and I know as a counselor, because I'm listening, I'm not saying much. I'm just like, what's on your heart? And then they're like, man, I felt this was great. I felt great. This was a good time. And I'm like, because I listened to you. I didn't offer a ton of solutions. I listened to you. And in listening to you, you were even able to process some things as I just listened to you. So I think Christians have to start just really being comfortable with being uncomfortable, maybe, like these. And I think for Black people, these aren't uncomfortable because a lot of times we live it. We just live it all our lives. And so it's like, this is like breathing almost, you know what I mean? So it's not uncomfortable. But I think as Black people, we also have to extend a certain amount of grace and mercy for people who are uncomfortable with that type of conversation. So you're not jumping down somebody's throat if they're fumbling over words or like sweating or like, I don't know if I want to talk about this. I was like, hey, brother, listen, I'm not judging you. Can we talk, So.
Well, this is a great place to close with our last question. What does Jesus have to do with it? This topic. And I'll go first, then I'll let you close. And so we quote Philippians 4 a lot on this podcast, be anxious of nothing. What we don't quote is Philippians 4:1-2, where Paul says that there's two leaders, great names for your kids, Euodia and Syntyche. And he says, I hope that you reconcile to each other. I hope that you come together. And I just think about our conversation. So in the same chapter that Paul is asking these two leaders to reconcile to each other, he says, be anxious of nothing, but in everything in prayer and supplication. And the Bible is far more forward than we give it credit. To be able to kind of, in that letter, those women were hearing that passage read. They heard their names, and it says, be anxious of nothing. So what does it look like? Why does reconciliation matter to mental health? Well, you can begin to let go of your need to be right. You begin to let go of your bitterness. You begin to see clearly. You grieve better. And all coming from the place that you've talked about, that when you know what Jesus has done for you in the forgiveness and death and resurrection, it doesn't take the pain away, but it allows you to reframe it in such a powerful way. So,
absolutely, I think you summarized it really well. Yeah, I mean, I think the same. Really, essentially, that you are just free to love. You're free to love when you let go of the pain and the hurt and just cling to Jesus for it and ask him for his help to do it, right? I need your help, Lord. I can't do this. This is another reason why I need you, because I can't forgive, I can't reconcile without your help. So please help me to do it. And if it doesn't happen the way I'd like it to happen, that's fine too. At least I'm trusting you and hoping and praying for the best.
Man, that's a great place to end. Don't forget, if you want to share this episode, the best way to get a hold of us is go to whygodwhypodcast.com. Click the subscribe button. We email you the episode every week. Share this on social media. You can find Carl. Carl is everywhere. We love that. Facebook, LinkedIn, his new podcast, Surviving Depression. Go to Amazon, buy his book, The Progressive Darkness. So yeah, and buy one of those t-shirts if you're watching online. And he's got hoodies too.
Yep.
So Carl, I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing. this was a tough conversation. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion points.
I hope so.
What the great part about a podcast is we don't hear the conversation.
Right. Yeah.
So, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, everybody have a great day.